Hello, BookTube. Micah Cummins and I did an impromptu buddy read of Essex Dogs by Dan Jones a couple of months ago. And it was a forward-facing buddy read. It was something that you could join in on. We didn't just do it in private. We both really enjoyed it. Enjoyed the experience of it. And in my enthusiasm, I then chose our next book, which was Shogun, which is about 5,000 pages long and almost killed Micah. I'm not sure he's even finished now. We did a buddy read of Shogun, and you were all invited to join in. That was a lot of fun. But for April, I thought, why not go for something much, much shorter? But in doing that, I picked something so short that I thought maybe we could do multiple readings. Because it's Beowulf, which has, since the 19th century, has had a million translations. So we are going to do Beowulf for the whole month of April. We're starting off with the translation that was done by J.R.R. Tolkien. Then we'll move on to the Penguin Classic translation. Then Burton Raffles' translation, which was by far the best-selling version of this poem in the 20th century in English. And then Seamus Heaney's translation to finish up our discussion of translations. But that's still going to leave us one extra weekend. And we're going to read John Gardner's little novel, Grendel, which a lot of you probably already read. It's a staple in schools, or it was at one point. That's going to be a lot of fun to see it from Gardner's point of view and from Grendel's. but for this week, we're concentrating on this translation. Which was done by Tolkien when he was still a comparatively young man. He was still in his 30s when he did this in 1926. And he didn't do it for publication. He was still years away from becoming an Anglo-Saxon, a professor of Anglo-Saxon literature at Oxford, which a position that he held for decades, where he was never done with this poem and never wanted to be. He grappled with this poem in a series of very popular lectures all throughout that time, coming back to one aspect after another of Beowulf. But he had, of course, tried his hand at both a verse and a prose translation that didn't go anywhere. He was a bit of a perfectionist for what he would show to the public, and the fact that he was a bit of a perfectionist for what he would show to the public has, in the past, caused me to have a less than charitable view of what his son Christopher spent his entire life doing, which was exhuming the stuff that Tolkien didn't think was ready for the spotlight, carefully annotating it and organizing it, dating it, and presenting it to the public. For years, I thought, well, that's not the right thing to do. That's no way to honor your father, to make a comfortable living, presenting works to the public that he never wanted the public to see. Now, I guess now that Tolkien is gone and now that Christopher Tolkien is gone, I think I see that endeavor with a lot more optimism. I like that endeavor a lot more, especially since Christopher Tolkien is dead now. So it's the quality of his work that has to speak for itself, and it's extremely high quality work. If Tolkien had never had a Christopher Tolkien, if Tolkien had never had his son as his literary executor, and the literary executorship had gone to somebody else who had done this conspicuously conscientious a job, I would have been applauding them this whole time. I think it might have been the family connection that was doing it. It was the death of Christopher Tolkien. I didn't realize how much I'd miss him until he was gone. And it was also something that happened right around the same time. I don't think that was a coincidence, which was the full technicolor sight, in my eyes, of a complete desecration of the works of Tolkien in Amazon's The Rings of Power. A complete desecration of Tolkien. Something that not only would Christopher Tolkien not have allowed it, which is why it didn't happen until he was dead, but J.R.R. Tolkien would not have allowed it. Or if the copyright had run out of his hands, he would have on every talk show from here to Istanbul condemning the thing and telling fans not to watch it. Turns out fans didn't need a whole lot of advice not to watch it, but it was those combination of things that made me look at books like this, reconstructions like this, a lot more charitably. And in the case of this Beowulf volume, actually enthusiastically, because this is an invaluable contribution to scholarship, what Christopher Tolkien has done in this volume. Not only has he exhumed the verse translation of Beowulf that Tolkien did, but he has loaded this book with the text, the cleaned up text of those lectures, with tons and tons of other commentary, stuff that Only Tolkien scholars would ever have been able to find it. It's now all in one attractive book with his Beowulf. That is incredible. That is absolutely amazing. Now that I think about it, now that I'm free to think about it clearly, I see how amazing that is. And that's what we're doing for this week. This is the Beowulf that we're doing for this week. I noticed in Micah's video, he has never read any other translation, so he doesn't have it. He's read this one before, so he doesn't have anything else to compare it to, and wanted to talk about the poem a little. I think that's a good idea. We never actually did a grounding video for what Beowulf actually is. This is Old English, so this is not Chaucer. You could not look at a text of Beowulf as a modern English reader and understand it. You need to be taught this language. You need to learn how to do it. In fact, for Tolkien's classes, often there were exercises you had to demonstrate that you could translate this work, at least a part of it. And the speculation on when this poem survives in only one manuscript, which is a scary thing to think about, and actually true for a number of works that I like, including one of my favorite Roman poets. It survives in only one manuscript, and that manuscript is not complete. And of course, it's not in the shape that we would like. So guesstimating when this was written down in the form that, roughly the form that we know it today, is a scholar's game. There's not going to be any definitive answer. We could say around the year AD 1000. With AD standing for Anno Domini, which translates to the year of our Lord, and the Lord in question is Jesus Christ. Okay? Just so we're clear about that. It's not BCE, it's AD 1000, which stands for Anno Domini, which was translated as the year of our Lord, and the Lord is Jesus Christ. Okay? And changing that to anything else, or thinking that if you use that, you must be, I don't know, discriminating against Jews or Muslims, is just as dumb as if someone said that the fact that you drive a Ford pickup truck means you are a stockholder and an employee of Ford. That is just as dumb. And you might think, well, then why am I never seeing it? Why are my professors telling me to change AD to ACE or CE or something like that? And the reason why is because modern academia has been completely co-opted by childish fascists. That's why. By fascists who think like children, and childish people who want to control what you do. So childish fascists, that's the reason. But anyway, I digress. So this thing, roughly, the poem that we're talking about roughly dates from AD 1000, let's say. The poem is much older than that. The story, at least chunks of it, is much older than that. I myself believe that the bones, the skeleton, the DNA of this poem is much older than AD 1000. But even if we were to say a couple of centuries older, that is very much visible in this work. This is like so many ancient epics. This is very clearly the work of multiple hands, and in this case, multiple creeds, because you will be getting a heroic story plunked down squarely in the middle of a mytho-heroic pagan past, when suddenly you can practically feel the medieval cleric elbowing his way in into the story. So the story will say that the fens and bogs of ancient Denmark were full of nameless creatures of formless dread, and then the cleric will elbow his way in and say, "Who responds of Satan?" Things like that. In my opinion, it's pretty easy to see that the Christian religion is just shoehorned onto a much older work here. But be that as it may, this didn't actually come into the light of the modern world for almost 1,000 years after it was written in the form, in the one copy that we have. It was only in the very early 19th century that any bits and pieces of this were translated into modern English. The 19th century made up for that by translating it like crazy, and the 20th century as well. This is an incredibly often translated work, which is what gave me the idea to do 4 different translations in the month of April. So that's what we're doing for this week. But the story, I'm sure it will be familiar to you. You probably had to read this in school. I'd actually be very curious to know if you did have to read this in school. Oh, I don't want to block the baby's face. And you might have even seen the disastrous movie. It was a disastrous not live action, sort of stop action animation, CGI type scratch and sniff Hollywood special effects movie that was, let's just say, not very good. The story involves King Hrothgar in Denmark, who has this absolutely fabulous hall, a gigantic mead hall of Heorot, with huge wooden pillars and rafters and gigantic communal fires and trenchers for food and wine and whatnot. A place for warrior men to make merry at the end of a hard day of oppressing their serfs and whipping their slaves. And Heorot becomes the attention of a monstrous creature from the fog, from the foggy bottomland, from the fells, Grendel, who's not human. He is a monster. And the cleric is elbowing in saying, like all the descendants of Cain. Yeah, got it. Thanks, Seymour. Grendel latches onto Heorot and starts visiting it nightly and destroying warriors, killing people. And he makes it a desolation. This happens for years, where for some reason that the poem never makes clear, Hrothgar's men never really do anything about this. We're never told that they fortify Heorot. They certainly could. We're never told that they do. We're never told that any of them actually fight Grendel. And we're never told that during the bright light of day, on a nice warm summer day, they take fire or heavy armaments to the foglands to kill whatever lives there. They don't do anything like that. Instead, they sort of languish in this existential woe of this monster that's constantly coming to their hall and killing people. And they also don't call for help, but they get help anyway from Geatland, from the champion of the Geats, a man named Beowulf, who has the long wavy hair and the jutting jaw and the chainmail and a loyal band of companions. But more than anything else, for an ancient epic, he has superpowers. That's the important thing, is that he has superpowers. It's not that he's a valiant warrior. We have to assume that Hrothgar had his share of valiant warriors. And they became toothpicks for Grendel. Instead, it's that Beowulf has superpowers. We're told that he has a strength of 30 men, which would put him in the lower ranks of Marvel superheroes in terms of super strength. That's a lot. That's 3,000 pounds or more that he can handle with his hands. And on top of that, he has superhuman endurance. He can fight monsters underwater for long periods of time without coming up for air, and keep fighting forever and ever. Let's not talk about the Beowulf Grendel combat scene from that movie. I do not understand that movie. Is it 10 years old? With Anthony Hopkins as Hrothgar? I still don't understand that movie. I have no idea what I saw. Crispin Glover is Grendel. But in reality, in the poem, the combat doesn't take long. Beowulf and his comrades sail to Hrothgar's kingdom. They offer their services, and Beowulf delivers. He fights the monster barehanded and rips off his arm. So Grendel receives a fatal wound and howls off into the night and dies. And this does not please Grendel's mother. Grendel's mother then needs to be dealt with herself, and Beowulf does. He fights her and kills her. So the poem opens in slam-bang fashion, where this superhero kills two monsters. Grendel's mother had never bothered Hrothgar, as far as we know, but doesn't matter. She can't do anything now. Beowulf's duty as a hero in this novel is to fight monsters. And then he sails home, and eventually he becomes king of Geatland, but the novel jumps forward 50 years. We have to assume, Beowulf being a mythic hero, that he fights monsters that whole time. Certainly, the mountain of Beowulf fanfiction that I have read has assumed that he fights monsters that whole time. There was even a 4-color comic book a long time ago, 50 years ago, in which Beowulf fights monsters. It was quite good. I wonder if those issues are collectible. They might be. And then at the end of his life, there is one more monster. Then the poem resumes, and an older, but still very powerful Beowulf fights a dragon and kills the dragon, but it receives a fatal wound himself in a kind of a motif that we see all throughout, for instance, Norse mythology, where the victory is never without a fatal cost. Most especially Thor fighting the Midgard serpent and winning, but only to be poisoned himself. The same thing happens to Beowulf. He dies, and the poem ends with his funeral obsequies, which I doubt very much. I don't think there's any evidence that whoever wrote this book, whoever wrote this poem, or how many ever people wrote this poem, I don't think there's much, when you read it, there's much indication that that poem was, that person or people were aware of Homer's Iliad. I don't think, I've seen it argued sometimes in unconvincing undergraduate papers that the gigantic funeral obsequies at the end of the poem are meant to echo the funeral celebrations of Hector at the end of the Iliad. I don't see that myself. But that is the bones of the poem. It's not long at all. It's a little over 3,000 lines, so it's not a long thing to read, and no wonder that it's tempting to translators. Not only because it's such a great story, but also because after a while, translators were also drawn to it by the fact that everybody and their brother had also translated it. So you get to see what you can bring into the mix, and that raises the question for today's video of what Tolkien brings to the mix. And Tolkien was worried about this translation. He finished it, but he didn't burn it. He didn't publish it, but he didn't burn it. He was well aware of the fact that it would probably be savaged by experts. And that didn't really bother him all that much. This was a guy who knew what he was doing, and he knew perfectly well from both sides of the coin what experts were like. Some of his colleagues at Oxford, if you saw them behaving the way they did in their classrooms, you would commit them to a psychiatric ward. So Tolkien knew both sides of that. It's not like he was insecure. But there's a reason that he didn't publish it. He would have worked on it. He would have worked it up into something better. And I love Tolkien, of course. I have been doing a chapter-by-chapter read-along of the Fellowship of the Ring. But I think it's easy to see in this our first translation of Beowulf why he didn't publish this and why he worried that critics would savage it. It's not very good. It's boggy. It's muddy. It doesn't know the register that it wants to take, and that is absolutely all important when it comes to translating a work like this. A kind of roughly analogous translating task would be Gilgamesh, where many hands have gone into the thing. We are pretty sure that the one and only text that we have is fragmentary. We're pretty sure that there are nuances that even now, after 2 centuries of study, we don't know. And the original text of Beowulf, that one text, happens, that the poem in that text happens in a very conscious way, a very stiff, stylized, conscious way. And if you are, young 30, 32, 33-year-old J.R.R. Tolkien, and you're looking at that and you're thinking, well, okay, I understand that, and I see it, and I even love it. But there's no way a modern audience will read that. No one writes like that anymore. No one's written like that in 1,000 years. No, or not 1,000 years, but since Chaucer, no one's written like this. So I can't translate it like that. I'm going to translate it in some other way. We don't do that anymore. Typically speaking, translators don't do that anymore. We'll see what our translators do for Beowulf in the rest of the month. But whether that's what Tolkien thought or not, he falls between 2 stools when he's trying to do this. On the one hand, he was already a budding expert in the world and the diction that gave rise to this poem. And on the other hand, he was already a budding genius of his own, with a budding linguistic and rhetorical control of his own. And it's really tough to marry those two. It's really tough to do. We're going to end our month of translations with a poet who does that. But that is really rare. That usually doesn't happen. And I'm afraid to report, at least for myself, that doesn't happen here either. This is a stodgy, boring translation of Beowulf. Sorry, I'm as big a fan of Tolkien as you are, but I am absolutely overjoyed that this volume exists. There's a lot of Tolkien writing in here, a lot, and a lot of it is great. My God, the things this man could accurately see in 2 lines of verse that whole generations of scholars had missed. It's just amazing. But The translation itself, the thing that is sort of the centerpiece of this book, no, not really. Not really. Not for me anyway. So our first week of Beowulf, it's the most famous translator, definitely. But it's not the best translation. I don't think it will be. I think it will be the worst of the 4 translations that we read this month. We'll see what Micah thinks. We'll see what you think. But anyway, that's our book to start off an April of Beowulf. It was with Professor Tolkien's version, and we'll see where we go from here. We're going to Penguin Classic next time, so we'll see how that fares matched up against this one. So I'll wrap this up for now. I'll see you then. Thank you, BookTube.